The Great Patriotic War and Stalin's Rule, 1941 to 1945. A full documentary-style script adapted for English-speaking audiences. How did a man who terrorized his own elites and decimated his own army become the leader who guided the Soviet Union through the largest invasion in its history and emerged on the victorious side? Why did a ruler known for crushing society under the weight of political purges suddenly transform that same machinery into a tool of national mobilization? And where is the line between Stalin's strategic calculation and the chaos he himself unleashed? In this film, we'll follow the Soviet Union from the shock of June 22, 1941, through the darkest days of war and into the brutal final push toward Berlin. We'll examine how Stalin rebuilt a collapsing command system, how factories were uprooted and moved thousands of miles east, how terror and mobilization blended into a single wartime machine, and how victory reshaped the regime more than anyone expected. In this documentary, we'll explore how the war transformed Stalin and how Stalin transformed the war. 22nd of June. Shock and system breakdown, June to July 1941. The morning of June 22, 1941, hit the Kremlin like a political earthquake. Intelligence reports had warned of German troop concentrations and unusual diplomatic behavior, but Stalin refused to believe Hitler would strike so soon. When the attack finally came, it shattered the assumptions on which Soviet strategy and Stalin's own worldview had rested. The first days were defined not by coordinated defense, but by paralysis. Stalin reportedly withdrew from decision-making for nearly 2 days. His voice was absent. His government hesitated. His generals were unsure how to act without explicit orders. Even the radio address on the day of invasion was delivered by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, not Stalin. On the front, disaster unfolded with shocking speed. The Red Army, weakened by the purges of the late 1930s, lacked experienced leadership. Officers were terrified of showing initiative. Troops were deployed too close to the border, trained for offensive operations, not defense. Within days, entire Soviet armies were encircled. Hundreds of thousands fell with stunning speed. Aircraft were destroyed on runways, ammunition depots abandoned, roads clogged with retreating soldiers. By early July, Stalin understood he had to reinvent his role. On July 3rd, he delivered a rare, emotional speech, opening with, "Brothers and sisters," a tone no one had heard from him before. The dictator who once spoke only through bureaucracy now addressed the nation as a wartime leader. The transformation had begun. The state of emergency. GKO and the Supreme Command, summer to fall 1941. The Soviet response to the early collapse was extreme centralization. On June 30th, 1941, Stalin formed the State Defense Committee, known by its Russian initials GKO. This emergency body placed every resource of the nation under the direct control of a tiny circle headed by Stalin himself. Parallel to it, the Stavka, the Supreme High Command, was reorganized to direct the war. At first, the Stavka operated as a collective of senior marshals. But by the fall of 1941, Stalin appointed himself Supreme Commander-in-Chief. Victory or defeat would now be tied directly to his personal authority. But the machinery still sputtered. Communications were delayed. Field reports were filtered or softened before reaching the top. And orders from the Kremlin often arrived too late or failed to reflect real frontline conditions. When German forces approached Moscow in October, panic spread across the capital. Government ministries packed archives and evacuated eastward. For a moment, it looked as if the state itself might collapse. Instead, Stalin stayed in Moscow. This decision, broadcast widely in Soviet media, helped stabilize morale. The symbolism mattered. The captain was not leaving the ship. By November, Moscow braced for a desperate fight. Harsh discipline measures were introduced. Commanders were warned that unauthorized retreat would be punished severely. The system relied not on flexibility, but on fear, its only stable currency. Evacuation and the economy of total war, 1941 to 1942. The Soviet Union had lost immense industrial regions, Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, within months. Without factories, steel, coal, and grain, the war would be lost. The solution was unprecedented, an industrial exodus to the east. Between July and December 1941, more than 1,000 factories were dismantled and loaded onto trains headed to the Volga region, the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia. Entire workforces, men, women, and children, traveled with them. Machine tools were bolted to wooden floors in half-finished buildings. Workers lived in tents and dugouts through brutal winters. But the results were transformative. By 1942-1943, these new industrial clusters were producing tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition faster than the factories Germany had captured. The Soviet Union, against all odds, built a wartime industrial powerhouse behind the Ural Mountains. Stalin acted not as an economist, but as a supreme allocator of national survival, approving which sectors received coal, which factories received freight cars, and which enterprises lived or died. Every priority was measured against one goal: feeding the war. Meanwhile, labor laws hardened. Absenteeism became a criminal offense. Collective farms were squeezed for grain beyond what was sustainable. Civilian consumption collapsed. Shortages and hunger spread. But the Red Army now had the weapons it lacked in 1941. The price was immense, but the alternative was defeat. Stalin as Supreme Commander, from Moscow to Stalingrad, 1941 to 1943. Stalin's personal evolution into a wartime leader continued through late 1941. The counteroffensive near Moscow pushed German forces back for the first time, giving the Soviet Union a vital psychological victory. Stalin claimed the success as validation of his leadership, while the military learned that every major decision now flowed through the Kremlin. But 1942 brought new disasters. A failed Soviet offensive near Kharkov cost hundreds of thousands of lives. German armies drove deep into the south, toward the Volga and the Caucasus. Stalin still pressed for attacks that generals warned were doomed. Then came Stalingrad. The fight for the city became the symbol of the entire war. Stalin ordered that it be held at any cost. Streets, factories, and even stairwells became battlegrounds. Behind the lines, Stalin enforced his harshest measures, blocking detachments to prevent retreats, special tribunals for cowardice, and the creation of penal battalions for disgraced soldiers. But when the Red Army launched its massive encirclement of the German Sixth Army, the entire balance of the war changed. The victory at Stalingrad in early 1943 was as much political as military. It legitimized Stalin's authority inside and outside the USSR and marked the moment when the initiative shifted permanently to the Soviets. From now on, Stalin was not just directing the war, he embodied it. Fear, repression, and deportation on the home front, 1941 to 1945. Even as the war raged, Stalin maintained a second battlefield of his own: internal control. During the war, the NKVD tightened its grip. Soldiers who surrendered were labeled traitors by default. Commanders taken prisoner were declared criminals. Families of cowards or deserters faced discrimination or arrest. Behind the front, the Gulag expanded its role. Prisoners built roads, mined coal, and worked in arms factories. Anyone who questioned orders, complained about shortages, or failed to meet production quotas could be arrested. Then came the mass deportations. Between 1943 and 1944, entire ethnic groups, Chechens, Ingush, Crimean Tatars, Kalmyks, and others, were forcibly removed from their homelands and packed into cattle cars bound for Central Asia. Many died during the journey or in the harsh first winters of exile. The official justification was collective treason, though thousands of men from these same communities were fighting in the Red Army at the time. For Stalin, repression was not a temporary wartime tool. It was the foundation of his authority. The war simply amplified its scale. Turning the tide, Kursk, the Allies, and Stalin's rising power, 1943 to 1944. The Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 marked the moment when the Red Army seized permanent initiative. Unlike earlier battles, Stalin agreed to a defensive strategy, something he had resisted for years. Soviet defenses held. The counteroffensive shattered German strength on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, Stalin operated not only as a military leader, but as one of the central figures of the Allied coalition. At conferences in Tehran and later in Yalta, he negotiated directly with Roosevelt and Churchill over the future map of Europe. These meetings projected Stalin onto the world stage as a global power broker. But behind the smiles and handshakes was a hard geopolitical calculation. The farther west the Red Army advanced, the more of post-war Europe would fall under Soviet influence. Meanwhile, NKVD units followed the advancing front, arresting collaborators, fighting underground resistance movements, and installing pro-Soviet administrations. The war had become not just a fight against Nazi Germany, but a blueprint for a Soviet sphere of influence. The road west, from the Dnieper to Berlin, 1944 to 1945. In 1944, the Red Army launched a series of massive offensives that liberated Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, and pushed deep into Eastern Europe. Soviet troops entered Warsaw, Budapest, Vienna, and finally closed in on Berlin. Stalin's cult of personality now reached its peak. Posters, newspapers, radio broadcasts, and films all credited him personally for the army's victories. Generals like Zhukov and Rokossovsky received fame, but always beneath Stalin's shadow. As the Red Army advanced, political control marched with it. Secret police units filtered civilians, identified hostile elements, and shaped the new political landscape. Liberation and occupation blended into one. The battle for Berlin was the final and bloodiest act. Soviet forces stormed the city block by block. Casualties were staggering. But on May 2, 1945, the city fell. A Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag, an image that would become the defining symbol of victory. For Stalin, it was the ultimate vindication. 1945, victory came at an almost unimaginable cost. around 27 million Soviet citizens died: soldiers, civilians, prisoners of war, victims of occupation, and victims of their own government. Entire cities were flattened. Families were shattered. The social fabric of the nation was torn apart. Yet politically, Stalin emerged stronger than ever. Internationally, he was the leader of one of the world's two superpowers. Domestically, he was celebrated as the architect of victory. His mistakes of 1941 were erased by propaganda. His purges were buried beneath the myth of national unity. The wartime emergency powers hardened into a permanent system. The Gulag did not shrink. The deported nations were not allowed to return. Former prisoners of war faced suspicion and often imprisonment. The command economy remained geared toward heavy industry and militarization. The war had not softened Stalin's regime, it had fortified it. And yet the war also left deep scars. A militarized society, a traumatized population, and a state addicted to control. The Soviet Union emerged victorious, but at a cost so vast that the country would feel its effects for generations. Victory in 1945 was not the end of Stalin's war. It was the beginning of a new world he intended to shape. With Berlin in ruins and Europe exhausted, the Soviet Union suddenly stood as a dominant continental power. But what would Stalin do with this new position? How would a leader forged in revolution, purges, and wartime mobilization govern a world now divided between hope for peace and fear of the next conflict? To understand the post-war years, we must look at how Stalin interpreted victory and how the world, in turn, interpreted Stalin. The post-war vision, Reconstruction under an Iron Hand, 1945 to 1947. The war had ended, but the harsh logic of mobilization did not. The Soviet Union lay in ruins, thousands of towns destroyed, millions of homes lost, vast tracts of farmland burned. Most nations after such trauma would shift toward rebuilding civilian life. Stalin chose a different path. Reconstruction began with another 5-year plan, but its priorities were unmistakably militarized. Heavy industry, steel, coal, and weapons production received top resources. Consumer goods, housing, and food lagged far behind. The population, already exhausted, was asked for more sacrifice. Food rationing continued until 1947. The countryside struggled to recover, worsened by a severe famine in 1946–47 caused by drought, mismanagement, and grain exports. The government continued shipping abroad to project strength. In this climate, Stalin tightened internal control. Wartime censorship remained. Former prisoners of war were screened, interrogated, and often punished, as if surviving captivity were itself a crime. Ethnic groups deported during the war, Crimean Tatars, Chechens, Ingush, and others, were not allowed to return home. Their exile became permanent. The war had not softened the regime, it had hardened it. The Soviet sphere, redrawing the map of Europe, 1945 to 1950. As the Red Army advanced during the final years of the war, it left behind not just liberated cities, but new governments. Stalin understood that political geography would be shaped not in conference halls, but by the armies occupying the streets. Across Eastern Europe, communist parties backed by Soviet officers took power. In Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany, elections were influenced, opposition parties intimidated or dismantled, and economies reorganized around Moscow's model. To Western observers, this looked like expansion. To Stalin, it looked like insurance. He believed another invasion, another 1941, was inevitable someday. A belt of loyal states between Germany and the Soviet border was his answer. The West saw an empire growing. Stalin saw a buffer zone being built with urgency. Tensions rose quickly. In 1946, Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech, declaring that Europe was divided. The phrase stuck because it felt true. A new conflict, colder but no less consequential, was taking shape. By 1949, the Soviet Union had detonated its first atomic bomb. The superpower rivalry was now locked in. The personality cult at its height, late 1940s to early 1950s. Inside the Soviet Union, Stalin's image reached an almost mythic scale. Portraits hung in every school, every factory, every home. Textbooks praised him as the man who saved civilization. Films, songs, poems, and parades built a world where Stalin was not just a leader, but the embodiment of the nation's destiny. Criticism, even mild, was unthinkable. The security services watched closely for incorrect thoughts. Academics reshaped fields, from linguistics to genetics, to match Stalin's personal opinions. Military leaders who had risen during the war, like Marshal Zhukov, were sidelined to prevent any rival center of authority. Even high-ranking party members lived in fear. A wrong word, a misunderstood joke, or a private complaint could lead to arrest. As the Cold War grew, Stalin's suspicion deepened. The atmosphere of the late 1940s resembled the purges of the 1930s, more understated, but no less chilling. The late Stalin era, crises and the shadow of death, 1950 to 1953. The early 1950s brought new pressures. The Korean War erupted, and Stalin supported North Korea with weapons and advisors, calculating that a distant conflict could weaken the United States without drawing the USSR into direct confrontation. The gamble escalated global tensions and solidified the Cold War divide. Inside the USSR, the regime launched new political campaigns. The Stalingrad affair targeted prominent party leaders. The 1952 doctors' plot accused mostly Jewish doctors of conspiring to poison Soviet officials, a case that terrified the country and hinted at the possibility of another wave of purges. Then, suddenly, in March 1953, Stalin suffered a massive stroke. What followed was a moment of national paralysis, reminiscent of June 1941, but inverted. Instead of fear that the nation might fall, there was fear of what might finally be revealed. When Stalin died on March 5, 1953, citizens mourned sincerely, but the inner circle exhaled with relief. A chapter of history closed. A different Soviet Union would slowly emerge from his shadow. Legacy of War and Power: How 1941 to 1945 Defined Stalin Forever. Stalin's wartime rule shaped the Soviet Union for decades. It forged a superpower, but at a cost measurable in millions of lives. It defeated Nazi Germany, but entrenched a system built on fear. It pulled the USSR from disaster to triumph, but left it scarred, suspicious, and rigid. For Stalin, the war was the ultimate justification. Proof that his methods worked. Proof that his authority was necessary. Proof that the Soviet people could endure anything, because they had no choice. For the world, the war revealed something else. A nation capable of extraordinary resilience, and a ruler capable of extraordinary ruthlessness. These contradictions defined not only Stalin's rule, but the entire path the Soviet Union would follow until its collapse decades later. If you found this extended look at Stalin's wartime and post-war years insightful, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into history. And tell us in the comments, which part of this era do you want to see explored next? The Cold War, the Gulag, the rise of Khrushchev, or something else entirely?